Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
We're gonna have a relatively short session. I've got 3 people that I asked to come talk because I thought they were doing and thinking interesting things about populations and data that were off the radar. The piece of this that I've been thinking about a lot is the people who choose not to be on social media or whose stuff is masked in some ways, whether the people who we can't study the way they're using it because they aren't necessarily using it. And so I've got 3 people that are going to be talking as a part of this. Zeynep Tufekci, who you may remember, the K comes before the C in her name, is gonna talk about some of the research she's done on college students and particularly those who opt not to participate in sites like Facebook. Lee Rainey from Pew Internet is going to talk about some of the data they have on what people are using or choosing not to use, the people who are taking breaks from social media, things like that. And Matt Buchanan from BuzzFeed is going to talk about some of you may have seen the piece that he wrote in response to Alexis Madrigal's The Dark Social concept. And he wrote a really interesting response to that I wanted to talk about in terms of what we are or are not seeing in the various statistics and things that are out there. So I'm going to turn this over to Zeynep. The way we're going to do this is they're each going to talk for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll take some time for you to be able to ask questions of them before we go on to the next person. So you can sit there. It's fine. So, okay. Zeynep, all yours.
It is indeed my name right there, and I don't actually care about the K before C. It was just getting amusing how many misspellings I was getting. And I'm currently at Center for Information Technology Policy and Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, but I'm an assistant professor at University of North Carolina. And I used to come to events like these, bunch of smart folks, and give like the strongest presentation I could give about something I was more sure about. And people would go, and then that would kind of be it. Then I realized I'm wasting all the brain power. I am going to present about stuff I'm not sure about. I'm completely going on a limb. I might really be stupid about this. And somebody give me feedback and correct me and tell me you don't know what you're talking about. I think this is a much better use so far, all the smart people here. So what I want to look at is my kind of this 4 or 5 year thread. I've been thinking about who's not on social media. And also, I've been thinking a lot about why do we keep discussing whether social media is isolating or not, whether it produces loneliness or not, whether it creates, this effect of more disintegrated society, because the data, the empirical data at the national level at pretty much every country we have says that's really not the case. If anything, there are strong effects that seem to come from television, maybe suburbanization, but not social media. But the debate never keeps dying. It was just a couple months ago, I think Atlantic had the Facebook Making You Lonely, sort of the cover story, correct. And it just keeps coming up and up and up, and it seems not to be, the story seems unkillable by any amount of data. So I started thinking, why is this story unkillable by data? I mean, what do we need? Beheading, silver bullets? And I thought maybe this was a cohort effect. Maybe this was just sort of a generational effect. And I'd been thinking about this. And being a college professor, I get to survey my captive audience, college students occasionally. And I noticed that in my surveys that it was not a cohort effect, that I kept finding this persistent 30 to 40% of the cohorts I was surveying that said, I don't really like interacting on social media. It's just, there's something not real about it. I would survey them, I would ask these questions, I would get these percentages, I would track them down, I would interview them, I would do, more systematic focus groups or more ethnographic studies. I would also just chat with my students in the corridors, and I would find this non-cohort effect pretty persistent. So I thought, okay, maybe there's something here. So my early studies, when I looked at my... So the early days, I would find about 10% non-users. And they would be a mix of late adopters, immigrants, people who just come, and something I am going to call cyber asocial folks, and I'm going to explain that a little bit later. But I did write about that a little bit in a paper, Grooming Gossip, Facebook, and MySpace. There was a MySpace back then. A recent survey, a friend of mine ran a survey, again in a college, and added a few of my questions about this. And he had a yes-no question for, are you on Facebook? I didn't see designing the survey. I would have said that's not going to work. So we have an N of 303 and 1 no. So there's no variation. I can't do anything with it. It's kind of funny. There was one non-adopter in the whole survey. Yes, it was a convenience sample. It was a regular college. So Facebook is pretty common now. So what are some of the effects of adoption that we know about? There's the cohort effects, right? My grandmother's not on Facebook. She's just not going to use it. But, for example, she also never used to talk on the phone with me because she grew up at a time where you got charged by the minute. So you'd call her and she'd say, hi, Zainab, bye. I'll see you soon. I'd be like, thanks, Grandma, you know. And I finally convinced her, you know, I'm not getting charged by the minute, which I was lying at the time because it was an international call. But I wanted to talk to her. And she finally started chatting, and she kind of got used to it. So there's a lot of cohort effects. People who grew up with the technology might not be very familiar. It's still true. So that's fine. There are social norms. So we have a lot of this. Our cohort, they are the 303. They're all on Facebook except one. And I'm going to go check if that's a data entry error. Clearly, that's a big social norm. And if you talk to college students, a lot of them will say it is very hard not to be on Facebook. I am recently seeing what I call the refusenick crowd. They're so cool they're not on Facebook. They're so above it all. But that's a recent thing, and it usually requires a lot of social capital to begin with. So social norms. Political. In some places, I do a lot of research on social movements, Middle East. In some places, there's a lot of politics involved in choosing a platform. You know, being on Twitter on China is a very political statement. You know, being on Facebook on Iran, and in Egypt, I watched Twitter and Facebook completely change meaning over the sort of past 2 or 3 years. So sometimes it's a political statement, and yes, we have this, and I'm just sort of pointing out some of the things we do know. But this is the part I'm going on out on a limb. I think there might be personality factors we have understudied that go into not necessarily the adoption per se, but how people use these tools and what they get out of it, what they don't get out of it. And I'm going to talk about one that I've been sort of playing with for years. I don't have anything conclusive, but again, such a smart crowd, I'm going to put it out there and look like an idiot. So I came up with this sort of working definition of people who are unable or unwilling to interact with on social media as if it were like same kind of thing as face-to-face. Not the same, of course, but as if it were a fully social interaction. I'm going to explain what I mean by that. I came up with this after talking to lots of people who did not want to socialize using these tools. And yes, I made that up. So there we go. What is it? To explain, let's go back and remember something about face-to-face sociality. It is not, it's very primal. If you show a 4-day-old baby or a week-old baby faces just like figures arranged like a smiling face, that baby will react differently to that face than if you have the same sort of figures arranged a little differently. If you have a crowd of people and there's an angry person in the crowd, your brain will pick that up very quickly. There's just certain things in our brain. It's just who we are. As human beings, we're social creatures. And one of the things in a lot of experiments, if you compare 3-year-olds with chimps are better at math at 3. The only thing 3-year-olds are better are social interaction, reading faces, all those kinds of things. So there's a huge amount of evidence on how primal and important and significant and evocative and in many ways primary face-to-face interaction is. And it's universal. Now, text to social requires a certain kind of hack. Seeing words like flat on a screen and having that same sense of presence requires a certain kind of hack. And to explain what kind of hack it is, let me give you guys an example of one you probably don't ever think about, which is reading. Reading, speech for linguists. If you talk to a linguist, for them speech is this completely oral thing. Language is an oral thing. It has nothing to do with your visual system. Speech and language and hearing, yes, we have deaf people and they have a visual language, but that too is a kind of a hack. But the parts of your brain that are involved in this are your speech side. But we can read and have that be transferred into language. That is a recent invention. It requires a lot of training for us to do. That's why we put kids through, K through 12, and maybe the first 4 or 5 years are just getting fluent in this thing called reading. Since academics tend to be very literate people, we don't really always sort of think about what an effort it is. And the hack doesn't always work. We have people with dyslexia. We have other kinds of reading difficulties. If you've experienced it, it just doesn't come together. You can't really use your visual system as easily. So maybe I thought, dyslexia is when the hack doesn't work fully. Maybe I thought there's something to being able to evoke the social presence through text that's also the similar kind of, you just don't get the sense of somebody being present there fully. I don't know. So the evidence I have for this is that it's not a cohort effect. I have tested, I've looked at this as many age groups as I can. Yes, it is more, in older people who didn't grow up with technology, but it is not a cohort effect. I have interviews and surveys with kids who've grown up with this technology, and I see the stark divide. Some of them say, yes, totally, I can interact with someone online socially, and that's fine with me. And others who are like, until I am face-to-face, that text is just hollow. It just does not work. So I don't think it's a cohort effect, although there are. It's not a proxy for anything on the classic Big Five personality. It's not a proxy for extroversion. It's not extroverts versus introverts. It's not a lot of things that you think it might be that, personality things, sociality things that psychologists measure routinely. We have tested this, and it doesn't correspond to any of these. It's not a proxy for social capital. I interview these, and I look at their sort of friendship networks. I look at how social they are. And there are some, being at the modern world as it is shaped, there are some disadvantages if you're not very adept at interacting online, but they have similar levels of friends that they see offline. They, the people who don't like socializing online are not necessarily more or less lonely. In fact, it's very hard to find effects, even though the divide on whether or not you like socializing online is so stark. It's not even a proxy for whether you use social media, because as we saw on that last one, there was one non-adopter. People who don't like to interact socially online are also, if they're in a place where this is the social norm, they're on Facebook. They just use it more instrumentally. They might post stuff, it's more of a conscious thing, I gotta do this, and there's an instrumental aspect to it. It's not as expressive socially. And also, the people who don't like to socialize online, I have found no evidence is tech phobia. They are very happy to do their online banking and everything else. So, what else could it be a proxy of? Is there a personality trait that is emergent with these new tools that we are overlooking? How should we test this? Or am I just completely off base? I'm seeing this effect, but it's actually X or Y or Z. So it's basically my plea to prove me wrong that this is nothing. Thank you. Questions? So are we going to take questions directly or at the end? Okay.
I wonder if one of the confounding factors we're teasing out what's a proxy for is different types of usage patterns. If you looked at that, generally people use it instrumentally, and so there's.
It corresponds with instrumental versus expressive use. So the people who are on the I don't want to do this, I have like a little scale for it, and the people who score high on the cyber A social scale, they will use it, but they won't do things like they won't sit and chat with people unless they really have to. They don't get a social feeling out of it.
And do you see people using, so just to finish the story, so there's lurkers, obviously, there always have been. But do you see a strong breakdown in people who are active but not interactive on social media or not?
I haven't really, no, because I'm looking at things like Facebook where it's just, I don't really see, I haven't really tested Twitter on this much, partly because Twitter on sort of young groups, there's a lot of confounding factors, so it's kind of hard to be, it's easier when it's a universal thing like Facebook because everybody's on it. The second thing I haven't tested that Mimi was suggesting earlier is things like video, talking over video becoming more, that's still a rare thing. So if that became universal, I could test it. Because of what I'm trying to test, it's best tested on things that they're all using. Yeah, Alice.
What if this isn't a proxy of anything? What if it's just kind of like a random personal preference towards something? I mean...
What?
I know, right?
That's crazy.
Well, that would be quite interesting because, I mean, you guys have seen... you guys have seen there's a recent book saying, you know, this is a world designed for extroverts and can we have some introvert power? And I'm like half and half. I'm extrovert when they put me there, but then I want to hide under the table sometimes. And so I get that it may well be that it's a world increasingly more designed for the cyber social. We might, if it does turn out to be something independent, there might have new disadvantages, advantages. It could have consequences for sure, yeah.
It was interesting when you were talking about practices of reading, because if you go all the way back, I mean, reading used to be a very public practice. When books were scarce, we would read aloud, not as a performance of our ability to read, but because it was doing a disservice to someone else not to read the book that you have. So we actually have these, if you go all the way back to like Francis of Assisi, or however you pronounce his last name, it would sort of be like he was known for reading privately, and that was remarked on because it was an unusual thing to do. And so I sort of wonder, and then now it's much more common to read privately. Like that's how we think of, especially when we're talking about books. You know, we think of that as like I'm reading privately. This is a space between my and my book. But I'm wondering if maybe one way of talking about this, some of the tensions that you're talking about is the shift to reading publicly again, and sort of having this reading be something collective and sharing. And so perhaps one way of thinking about these people who opt out is as a preference for reading privately.
That's a good question. We could look into whether there's more bookworms among them or not. You had your hand up?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you've looked at the relationship of this construct and also like an internet skill or literacy.
I have looked at it. It's not skill or literacy. I mean, there are many, in fact, there's lots of people that I know who are very tech literate and who still are like, I am not going to talk with you online, you know. Yeah.
Just a couple of weird thoughts. First one is obviously the discussion of the primacy of speech over writing has been going back to Plato. So there's like 2,500 years of that. But the thing that I'm kind of interested in is someone who really objects to Facebook, can't stand it, they use Twitter all the time. I'm like wondering about like, you know, is there any just sort of self-selection of like weird, you know, like I have people on Facebook I don't want to talk to. You know, so I don't go there and I don't engage in that participation because my cousin's daughter, who's 7, wants to talk to me about things and I feel really difficult about communicating in that
Well, that's the broad context collapse question that, I mean, a lot of people face. But I'm looking at the college students where there's a lot of people, they do want to talk to that. It is true, there are difficulties, but, you know, even for college students, because now you got parents on Facebook and all of that, and everybody's trying to negotiate that. But I haven't really found that come up. I've done a lot of interviews. I haven't really had people, because the people who are worried about that usually figure out the limited profile thing, and then they go on, you know, to escape parents, they go to Twitter to talk with, they find strategies to keep doing it, but not Facebook. So I haven't really encountered that. Yeah, Mike?
It sounds like you're confounding sociality with creating a visible representation of something, and maybe I misunderstood it. It sounds like there's I guess I'd want a few more, some more precision in some of the terms you're using. So participation, participation could be, you know, it could be creating a visible representation of something. It could be, you know, sending a tweet, it could be having some comment that should appear on Facebook, but participation can equally be listening. And I think we could replace the word lurking with listening. I'm going to channel Kate Crawford in saying that. But I think that how it seems to me like you're thinking about sociality is creating things that can be observed or measured. And I think that there's an act of being present as a form of participation that to me doesn't seem present in your conceptualization of sociality. So I just add listening as a concept for sociality.
And in a comment that knowing Mike as I do, he can't stand talking to people on the internet, often. So
yeah, all of the internet.
So I'm going for the question I'm trying to get at here is more. It's usually something when I'm talking with people about this is when you're chatting with someone or you're interacting with Facebook, do you feel like it's a social interaction? Does it feel real? I'm just sort of giving up. These are the words people use to me, so that's what I use. And usually they describe it as it just doesn't feel real. So I am talking about the interactive component, not talking about observing, listening. And you're right, that can be very social. I am just looking at this thing.
I think maybe the people who have that feeling have an ability to detect silence better than...
Yes, absolutely. I think, they can, it's a proxy for a finely tuned ability to detect silence, and we're on to you.
Yeah, so we have a paper coming out about adult non-users of Facebook. And one of the things that we found with them is that they mentioned not getting value out of Facebook. They just didn't see the usefulness of it, right? They didn't see any value. So I wonder if instead of like a personality factor, which is how you're describing it, there's a motivational factor, which is I have certain types of things I'm trying to accomplish with my life, and Facebook or social media may or may not be an appropriate way to express that.
I find that even after that. I mean, I find that even controlling for that, I see this effect. So I mean, yes, obviously, that's why I went through cohort effect, this and that. Obviously, there are lots of factors for adoption and non-adoption. I'm just saying, are we overlooking one? Did you have your hand up back there? Yeah, Lily.
We did this project on Asperger's, which was, they actually sat through all the clinical tests of kids with Asperger's, and the tests are really interesting. Like maybe talking to somebody who others sort of feels like that. So like one thing they said was, they asked a kid to brush their teeth. And they say most people will, a kid with Asperger's typically won't use gesture. So there's certain things that they don't do in communicating, and they can teach them that they can do better. So I mean, really just, I got the problem and the questions that you're raising are awesome, and there could be certain things that we just haven't seen.
There really might be all sorts of things that I'm not aware of that people in other fields might say, you know what, that corresponds to something. Mimi?
Set of questions you're asking. I'm just to geek out on the methodological part a little bit, and I think the question about whether it's giving expression on other platforms like Twitter is actually really important methodologically if you're trying to isolate a factor that's personality-based and not platform specific. So your factor that you're trying to isolate should be platform independent, and so if methodologically you're conflating the practice with the platform, you're not really able to make an empirical claim about whether it's a personality.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. The difficulty is the other platforms have so much confounding. I'm thinking about the same thing. I'm thinking, yeah.
There's no reason why you can't do elicitation for other sites just to test your presuppositions that you're doing on Facebook. So that's just a bit of a check and balance, because just as an ethnographer of these practices, I do think that Facebook is very specific in people's cultural imagination around sociability and is not a proxy for cyber sociability more generally.
Okay, so my cyber asociality questions are not Facebook specific, but what I have done is, sort of to geek more out on the methodology, is that I have tested them among the Facebook users, which in the last one turned out to be 100%. So my questions don't ask them about Facebook use. I just have been using the Facebook adopted cohorts to weed out people who are maybe not adopting any of this. And there's almost nobody in my cohort that's on Twitter and not on Facebook. In fact, I'm having difficulty finding anybody who's not on Facebook at all. So, but yes, absolutely. Next time I'm doing qualitative questioning, I'm going to be asking more about just the range of things. Yes.
So this is a somewhat different platform. I did a study on Stanford students using iPhones, and the ways that about 2/3 of them were actively disconnecting or limiting their iPhone use. Not totally, but they were saying like, this is so overwhelming and it can take over so much, I'm going to actively disconnect. But they expressed it in terms of identity, and it was a specific strategy they used. It's like, I'm a more natural person. I want to get back to nature. Or they use like, I'm a wholesome person. This is fragmenting my life, but expressing it in terms of identity was actually a strategy to make it seem more immutable. It's like,
So
you can't change this about me.
20% of my sample said that at one point or another they deactivated their Facebook profile, which kind of blew my mind as a number. They had, exams, they broke up with someone, so there's a lot of strategizing, but I'm talking about not using it, but just not being comfortable. Biela?
Yeah, I was wondering if you continue to do this is just kind of a methodological idea, whether you could get, like, let's just say at your university, you can kind of compile a lot of these people together and have them, let's just say, hang out on internet relay chat together in relationship to a class that they're taking as a kind of control group or something, or a different sort of cohort and a different sort of medium.
Well, I stick them into an MRI at the same time. That's kind of what I'm thinking.
And not just for a day, an entire semester as well. Because that can get at some of the interesting questions as to whether it's personality, affordances, these sorts of issues.
Yeah, we're going to Thank you so much, Zainab.